Hello. During the late 1800s, Europeans wanted to expand their control over unconquered lands of the world, like Asia, the Americas, and Africa, due to their own political and economic prospects. This new imperialism was met with resistance by the people of these lands, but will result in European colonization. One example is the European conquest of Africa during the late 19th century. In this lesson, we will be analyzing how European imperialism affects the people of Africa. Let's set some lesson goals to guide our learning. In this lesson, you are going to learn about imperialism in Africa, explain the causes and effects of the Scramble for Africa, describe Leopold II's rule in the Congo Free State, and describe how some Africans resisted European rule. Next, let's look at the vocabulary that will be used throughout the lesson. Let's take a moment to type these important vocabulary words into your e-notes and check your glossary for definitions. Stay on the lookout for these vocabulary words as you move through the lesson. Your vocabulary words are supplement, ivory, partition, quota, and atrocity. So let's get started on this lesson. Today we'll be seeking an answer to the question, how did European imperialism affect the people of Africa? To answer the question, we'll study what motivated European powers to colonize, the scramble for territory occupation in Africa, and the effects of imperialism on African cultures and societies. You just learned some of the words that will help you understand what happened in Africa during the time of imperialism. Now, let's warm up by taking a look at two explorers who were among the first Europeans to see part of Central Africa. Henry Stanley and David Livingstone were two European explorers who became famous for their discoveries in Africa. Now, David Livingstone was a European explorer and missionary who disappeared in Africa. Henry Stanley was a journalist sent to find him. Now, let's look at this drawing. You can see the moment when Stanley, who is right here on the left, found Livingstone in Africa. When Stanley met Livingstone, he reportedly greeted him with the now famous phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Stanley and Livingstone were the first known Europeans to see parts of Central Africa. Their books excited Europeans who wanted to colonize Africa. Stanley later gave up his job as a journalist to become a professional explorer. He also worked with King Leopold II of Belgium to claim a large territory in Africa. You'll hear more about Leopold later. For now, let's look at a quote from one of Livingstone's books. Livingstone's description of Africa might give you a clue about why European powers divided the continent among themselves. Stanley and Livingstone wrote about Africa for audience back home in Europe and America. Among other things, they describe a land of vast beauty and valuable natural resources. Now let's learn more about Africa and the reasons European powers were drawn there. We'll begin by getting a picture of life in Africa before imperialism. Africa is the second largest continent in the world. Some important features are the Sahara Desert. We also have the Nile River, Congo River, and Niger River. We also have very important seas. We have the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and then we have Lake Victoria. And there are many vast rainforests throughout Africa. Africa is also a home to a great diversity of cultures. Africa is home to a great diversity of cultures. When Europeans first began to explore Africa, they encountered thousands of different tribes, societies, and kingdoms. More than 1,000 languages were spoken. To understand why European powers were drawn to Africa, you only have to look at the natural resources that Africa contained. Remember, Europeans began colonizing during the age of exploration, but were limited to coastal areas only. During the 1800s, industrialization and new technologies led to the exploration of the interior, and other resources were identified. Some of these resources are gold and diamonds, rubber and palm oil. Now, rubber is a natural product that comes from rubber trees and vines. At the end of the 1800s, people began using rubber to make bike and car tires and other parts for machinery and equipment. Now we use synthetic rubber. Next we have ivory. Now ivory is the white tooth-like material that forms the tusks of elephants and related mammals. Ivory can be carved into decorative pieces, and before alternatives were available, it was used to make piano keys. Lastly, we have land for farming. Now land was good for growing cash crops such as coffee and cacao, which is used to make chocolate. Now the need for natural resources was closely linked to European involvement in Africa. The search for more natural resources was one of the most important motivations for imperialism. But there were other reasons why European powers established empires in Africa. Let's take a look at other motives or reasons behind European imperialism in Africa. Today we're going to look at this quote by Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was an English businessman who founded De Beers Diamond Company in South Africa. His quote says, "I contend that we are the first race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. If there be a God, I think that what he would like me to do is to paint as much of the map of Africa British red as possible." Now, Cecil Rhodes emphasizes the whole idea of ethnocentrism. Many Europeans believed it was their duty to civilize Africans by teaching them European ways and cultures. By now, you should understand the reasons why European powers want to establish empires in Africa. Now, let's review what you have learned so far. You have been learning information related to the lesson question, how did European imperialism affect the people of Africa? You now know what Africa was like when Europeans first arrived. You also discovered the reasons for European imperialism, including the search for natural resources and the desire to change African culture. Next, you will see how the European powers divided Africa, and you will also learn how imperialism affected Africans. Beginning in the 1880s, European countries scrambled to control parts of Africa. To bring order to the process, the European powers met at the Berlin Conference. It was significant for several reasons. It divided Africa among European countries. This time period is often called the Scramble for Africa. No Africans were invited to attend the Berlin Conference. Europeans did not respect African abilities to govern themselves. The lack of African involvement also meant the borders established by the conference were arbitrary and did not take into account traditional tribal or ethnic boundaries. This meant that tribal groups that had been at war for generations were suddenly thrown together under one government. This would cause significant problems later. Now, most of the continent was grabbed by France, Britain, and the Congo went to Belgium. Let's see how well you can read a map that shows what happened after the partition of Africa. Leopold II was a European king who wanted to establish an empire in Africa. Now, he ruled as king of Belgium. Now, Belgium is a small country just north of France. Leopold controlled an area in Africa that was 80 times the size of Belgium, and he was able to acquire this land after the Berlin Conference. Now, this region was under Leopold's personal control, not that of the Belgian government or parliament. Now, the people of Congo suffered greatly under King Leopold's rule. Let's look closer at the abuses that happened there. Leopold II's empire in the Congo made him very wealthy, but that fortune came at the expense of the African people, who were abused and mistreated under his reign. Some of the examples of this abuse, or physical abuse, included mutilating people who did not gather enough rubber. Those villages who failed to gather enough rubber or ivory would have one villager's hand or foot cut off for every item they were short. The quotas were impossible to meet, and villages starved to death because they could spend no time gathering or planting food. Some of these other atrocities included death and starvation. Now, millions of Africans died under Leopold II's rule. Historians do not know for sure how many were killed, but most put the number between 10 to 20 million. Let's take a look at this political cartoon right here. In this political cartoon, we see King Leopold II's face attached to a snake that is made of rubber. And this is rubber right here, attacking a Congolese man. In 1908, the Belgian government was forced to annex the region, and renamed it the Belgian Congo. They took away Leopold's control, but the Belgian parliament refused to hold any hearings about the atrocities committed there. One reason the Belgian parliament stepped in was a result of the British report of conditions there. Let's take a look at an excerpt. The Europeans had many advantages over the Africans, making it easier to establish empires in the continent. There were three main factors. First, new technologies. Some of these new technologies were rifles, artillery, ships, rail lines, and telegraph. Now, technology made it easier for people to travel and communicate from faraway locations. They could control population with fewer resources, and it was easier to move troops around when there was unrest. New medicines helped people avoid diseases while traveling or living in Africa. Next factor was lack of African unity. Africa had a multitude of languages and tribal societies, as previously discussed, making it really hard for them to unite as a nation. Lastly, the slave trade. The slave trade devastated many populations. Despite efforts to ban the trade in the early 1800s, it was still being practiced, making it harder to establish a stable government. These disadvantages did not stop all Africans from resisting. Let's look at a couple of examples of Africans who tried to resist European rule. The Zulus successfully resisted British occupation in southern Africa. Shaka was a chief who led the Zulu people. He was able to do this by successfully organizing the Zulu military and aggressively expanding Zulu holdings. He conquered other tribes and became ruler of a powerful African kingdom. Now, these forces successfully resisted British rule in the early 1800s by using advanced military tactics to defeat them. And they were also able to remain independent until 1879. Now, the Zulu were one of the many groups that attempted to resist European rule, and most ended up like the Zulu. Eventually, their rebellions were conquered. Now, let's look at another African leader who was able to secure long-term independence for his country. In 1889, Menelik II became the Emperor of Ethiopia, a country in East Africa. He is best known for defeating the Italian army in the Battle of Adwa. This fight marked the first time in modern history that an African army was able to defeat a major European power. Now, he won by buying weapons from France and Russia, who were competing with Italy in Africa. Now, Ethiopia's independence is unique because at a time when the rest of Africa was being divided between European powers, Ethiopia was one nation ruled by an African. Many African groups fought against European rule, but hardly any of them won their independence. Let's see why resistance to European power was so difficult. So why were Africans unable to resist? Let's look at this chart. Resistance was difficult for the Zulu. Reason one was because European soldiers had firearms, while the Zulu used spears and swords. And European rulers did not recognize tribal groups such as the Zulu as a modern nation. Now let's look at Ethiopia. Ethiopia remained independent because the Ethiopians had modern weapons. At the Battle of Adwa, the Ethiopian army outnumbered the Italians by 7-1. And lastly, European rulers signed the treaties that recognized Ethiopia as a modern nation. Now, let's review some of what you have learned in this lesson. You now know that the Europeans divided Africa into colonies without consulting the people of Africa, or considering traditional tribal boundaries. You also know that many Africans suffered under imperial rule, especially those in the Congo Free State. Now let's take a look at the widespread effects of imperialism. Imperialism had a significant cultural effects. Christianity spread across the African continent, making it the dominant religion south of the Sahara. Because European languages such as English and French were the official language of the colonies, Africans learned these languages to survive economically. In many countries, these languages are still spoken. Schools were also constructed, both missionary schools and colonial schools, increasing literacy and education levels in the continent, but only in some areas. This was actually one positive effect, as throughout Africa there was little formal schooling before the arrival of Europeans. Now let's turn to the political effects of imperialism. there were two important political effects of imperialism. The lines drawn across the continent to set up the colonial holdings created artificial boundaries that did not accommodate for ethnic, religious, or cultural diversity. So, this was an important cause of instability and internal conflicts when those countries eventually achieved independence. There were also other political effects as well. Europeans held most position in power and decision-making, giving Africans little experience in running governments. Also, imperialism created white minority rule. Finally, imperialism has significant economic effects for African people. Imperialism had economic, cultural, and political effects on Africa. The wealth of Africa was transferred out of the continent during the centuries of European rule. African colonies were forced to export raw materials, which were cheaper than manufactured goods. The wealth of exports made it into the hands of the European colonists, not the native population. There was no manufacturing or job creation. Instead, the labor force was exploited, like working in the mines, plantations, and so forth. Furthermore, because no finished goods were created, the region was forced to import those, resulting as actually a net loss of income despite the rich sources. Well, let me give you an example. Cocoa. Now, cocoa beans were grown in Africa and sent to Europe, where it was turned into chocolate in a factory. The chocolate is worth far more than the cocoa beans, so Europe benefited from its sale more than Africa did. There was no incentive to invest in hospitals, schools, infrastructures, and the average worker remained a laborer. There was no growth in the middle class or professional sectors. One positive effect was there was actually a significant construction of transportation infrastructures such as roads, rail lines, and ports, but it tended to only support of exports. So these were actually going to be only located where they're exporting materials. Now let's review what you have learned. Here are a few key events in the Scramble of Africa. In 1879, the British defeated the Zulu. From 1885 to 1908, we see Leopold II rule the Congo. We also see down here in 1885, the partition of Africa began. Also in 1896, Ethiopia defeated Italy. Now, here are a few other key events happening in the world at the same time. So we have right here the key events from Africa. Now let's look at the events going around the world. In 1853, we have the Commodore Perry arrived in Japan, and then on the outside of it, in 1914, World War II began.